Dad texted, "Don't come back. We've changed the locks and taken your name off the mailbox." I replied, "Makes sense. Just one thing you forgot." Then I canceled the $3,500 auto pay on the mortgage, the one I'd been covering quietly for 2 years after they gave my house to my sister. 2 weeks later, I got a voicemail from their realtor. The sale fell through. Call us urgently. I didn't. I, 29M, never thought my own parents would throw me out like garbage. But here we are. 2 weeks ago, I got that text from Dad while I was at work. No warning, no conversation, just a cold message telling me not to bother coming home because they'd changed the locks and removed my name from the mailbox. The house I'd been living in since college, the one I'd been quietly paying the mortgage on for 2 years. See, what they didn't know was that when they decided to give my childhood home to my sister last year, they forgot one tiny detail. The mortgage was still in my name from when I'd refinanced it to help them out during their financial troubles. They kept living there, acting like generous parents who'd handed over family property, while I silently transferred $3,500 every month to keep them from losing everything. My sister had just gotten married and needed a place to start her new life. Mom and Dad thought it would be perfect, hand over the house to the golden child and let her build her dreams there. Never mind that I'd been the one bailing them out for years, covering their debts, fixing their mistakes. I was just the backup plan, the reliable son who'd figure something else out. The morning I got that text, I was sitting in my office reviewing quarterly reports when my phone buzzed. I read the message 3 times before it really sank in. My own father telling me I was no longer welcome in the home I'd been financially supporting. No explanation, no discussion, just a cold dismissal like I was some deadbeat they were finally getting rid of. I called immediately, but Dad's voice was firm and final. He told me my sister needed the space for her growing family, that it was time I learned to stand on my own feet. When I tried to explain about the mortgage, he cut me off and said they'd figured out their own arrangements. Mom got on the phone and her tone was even colder, explaining how disappointed they were in how I'd turned out, how my sister deserved stability and security. That afternoon, I drove by the house after work. Sure enough, the mailbox that had read "The Johnson Family" now just had my sister's married name. My bedroom window, where I'd spent countless nights studying and working, now had pink curtains. It was like I'd been erased completely. I spent that night in a hotel, staring at my laptop screen, trying to process what had happened. My family had literally locked me out of my own financial obligation. They were living in a house I was paying for while treating me like I didn't exist. The injustice of it burned in my chest, but what hurt more was the realization that to them, I was just a wallet with legs. The next morning, I made a decision that would change everything. I logged into my banking app and found the automatic payment setup I'd established 2 years earlier. That $3,500 monthly transfer that had been quietly leaving my account like clockwork, keeping my parents afloat while they played house with my sister's new family. One click. That's all it took to cancel the auto pay. For the first time in months, I felt something like relief. If they wanted me gone, if they could change locks and remove my name from mailboxes, then they could figure out how to cover their own mortgage payments. I wasn't going to keep funding their fantasy while being treated like an unwanted guest. I found a decent apartment across town and moved my things from storage. For 2 weeks, I lived in this strange bubble of freedom and anxiety. Freedom because I wasn't walking on eggshells around people who clearly didn't value me. Anxiety because I knew what was coming. The first sign was a text from my sister asking if I'd heard from Mom and Dad lately, saying they seemed stressed about something. I didn't respond. Then Mom called and left a voicemail asking if we could talk, her voice notably less hostile than before. I deleted it without calling back. Exactly 14 days after I'd canceled that auto pay, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. The voice belonged to a realtor, professional but clearly frazzled. She explained that she'd been working with my parents on selling the house, that there had been a buyer lined up, but the sale had fallen through due to some complications with the mortgage. She needed to speak with me urgently about the financing situation. Could I call her back as soon as possible? I set the phone down and laughed. Actually laughed out loud in my empty apartment. They'd been trying to sell the house right out from under me, probably planning to keep whatever profit they made while I continued paying the mortgage like some kind of financial ghost. But they'd forgotten that pesky detail about whose name was actually on the loan. My phone kept ringing over the next few days. First the realtor, then Mom, then Dad, then my sister. Each voicemail more desperate than the last. Mom's voice cracked as she asked me to please call back, that there had been some kind of misunderstanding with the mortgage company. Dad's messages started angry but quickly shifted to confused, asking why the bank was saying I was the primary borrower. The realtor called again, explaining that the buyers had pulled out when the title search revealed complications with the property ownership and financing. She needed to understand who exactly owned the house and who was responsible for the mortgage payments. Her tone suggested she was beginning to piece together that something wasn't right with my parents' story. I didn't return any of the calls. Instead, I did something I'd been putting off for months. I called a lawyer and explained the situation. He listened carefully, took notes, and then gave me the most satisfying news I'd heard in years. Since the mortgage was in my name and I'd been making the payments, I had significant legal claim to the property. My parents couldn't simply sell it without my involvement, and they certainly couldn't transfer ownership to my sister without clearing the debt first. The lawyer also pointed out something interesting. If my parents had been accepting my mortgage payments while telling others they owned the house free and clear, that could constitute fraud, especially if they tried to sell it without disclosing the existing loan. Update 1. 3 weeks after canceling the auto pay, Dad finally swallowed his pride and called me directly. His voice was different this time, smaller, uncertain. He asked if we could meet for coffee, that there were some things we needed to discuss as a family. I agreed, curious to see how they'd try to spin this. We met at a diner halfway between my new apartment and their house. Dad looked like he'd aged 5 years in the past month. Mom sat beside him, fidgeting with her coffee cup, unable to make eye contact. The confident, dismissive woman who'd told me I was unwelcome in their home was nowhere to be seen. Dad started by saying there had been some confusion about the house situation, that they hadn't realized I was still handling the mortgage payments. He tried to frame it like an innocent oversight, like they'd simply forgotten about the small matter of $3,500 leaving my account every month. I let him talk, watching him stumble through his explanation. Mom occasionally nodded along, but I could see the panic in her eyes. She knew they'd messed up badly. When Dad finished his version of events, I calmly explained what I knew. That they'd tried to sell a house they didn't actually own, that they'd given property to my sister that was still encumbered by a loan in my name, that their realtor was now asking uncomfortable questions about fraud and misrepresentation. The color drained from Dad's face as I talked. Mom started crying, saying they'd never meant for things to get so complicated, that they'd just wanted to help my sister get established. She begged me to understand that they'd been trying to do what was best for the family. I asked them what family they were referring to, since they'd made it pretty clear I wasn't considered part of it anymore. Dad tried to backtrack, claiming the text message had been sent in anger, that they'd never actually wanted me to leave permanently. But I'd moved past anger into something much colder. I told them I'd already spoken with a lawyer, that the house couldn't be sold without my signature, and that any previous attempts to transfer ownership to my sister were legally questionable at best. Dad asked what I wanted, his voice barely above a whisper. For the first time in years, I had their complete attention. No dismissive comments about my life choices, no comparisons to my sister's accomplishments, no lectures about responsibility while they lived off my financial support. I told them I'd think about it and let them know. Update 2. The next few days were interesting. My sister called, finally, her voice tight with controlled panic. She'd apparently just learned that the house she'd been living in wasn't actually hers, that the mortgage she thought had been paid off was very much still active and in her brother's name. Her husband had gotten involved, demanding answers about the legal status of their living situation. They'd been making plans based on owning the property outright, and now faced the possibility of having to move out with nowhere to go. She asked if we could work something out, maybe arrange for her to take over the mortgage payments. When I mentioned that the monthly payment was $3,500, plus the $7,000 in missed payments from the past month, I heard her sharp intake of breath. Apparently, Mom and Dad hadn't shared those particular financial details. My sister's new family was living paycheck to paycheck, barely managing their own expenses. Taking on a mortgage payment that size was impossible. She started crying, saying they'd put their savings into renovating the house, improvements that would now benefit whoever ended up actually owning the property. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then she said something that reminded me exactly why I was in this situation. She asked why I was being so cruel, Why I couldn't just continue helping the family like I always had. Why was I suddenly being so selfish when they needed me most? That word, selfish, coming from someone who'd been living rent-free in a house I was financing while I got locked out and told I wasn't welcome. The irony was stunning. I told her the same thing I told our parents. I'd think about it. The realtor called again, more insistent this time. The mortgage company had contacted her directly, asking about the status of the property and whether there were any plans to bring the loan current. She was clearly frustrated with my parents for not being upfront about the financing situation, and her professional reputation was on the line. She asked if I'd be willing to meet with her directly to discuss options for the property. Her tone suggested she'd figured out that I was the one with actual decision-making power in this situation. I agreed to meet with her the following week. Update 3. The meeting with the realtor was enlightening. She'd done her homework and had a complete picture of the financial mess my parents had created. The house was worth about $280,000, and I owed roughly $195,000 on the mortgage. With the missed payments and penalties, the total amount due had grown to nearly $210,000. She explained that my parents had listed the house for $275,000, planning to pocket the difference after paying off what they thought was a small remaining balance. They'd told her the property was nearly owned free and clear, with just some minor paperwork to resolve. The buyers who'd pulled out were actually willing to meet the asking price, but they'd walked away when the title search revealed the mortgage discrepancy. The realtor asked if I'd be interested in proceeding with the sale if she could find another buyer willing to work with the complex ownership situation. I told her I'd consider it, but first I wanted to understand all my options. That weekend, I drove by the house for the first time since I'd been locked out. My sister's car was in the driveway, along with a small moving truck. Through the windows, I could see boxes stacked in the living room. They were preparing to leave. Part of me felt vindicated. They'd finally realized the precarious position they were in, living in a house they didn't own while the actual mortgage holder had been cut out of their lives. But another part of me felt tired of the whole situation. My phone buzzed with a text from Mom asking if I'd made any decisions about the house. She mentioned that my sister and her husband were looking for a rental, but were having trouble finding something in their price range. The subtext was clear. They were hoping I'd let them stay while they figured things out. I thought about everything that had led to this moment. Years of being taken for granted, treated like a backup plan, expected to solve problems while being excluded from decisions. The casual cruelty of that text message telling me not to come home. The assumption that I'd keep paying for their mistakes while they erased me from their lives. Then I thought about my sister, who genuinely believed our parents when they'd told her the house was hers. Her husband, who'd married into this family drama without understanding the financial quicksand beneath their feet. The renovations they'd paid for, the plans they'd made, the future they'd built on a foundation that didn't actually exist. I made my decision. Monday morning, I called my lawyer and told him to proceed with the foreclosure process. If my parents wanted to play games with ownership and mortgages, they could deal with the real consequences of financial responsibility. The house would be sold, the mortgage would be satisfied, and whatever was left over would be legally mine. I also called the realtor and told her I was interested in selling, but through the foreclosure process rather than a traditional sale. She wasn't happy about losing her commission, but she understood the legal realities of the situation. Then I called Dad and told him what I'd decided. His voice was hollow as he asked if there was anything that could change my mind, any way to work things out as a family. I reminded him about the text message that had started all of this, about the locks being changed and my name being removed from the mailbox. He was quiet for a long moment before asking what would happen to my sister and her family. I told him that wasn't my problem to solve anymore. They'd made it clear I wasn't part of their family decisions, so they could figure out their housing situation without my input. The foreclosure process would take about 3 months. My sister and her husband would have until then to find alternative housing. Mom and Dad would have to face the reality that their financial house of cards was finally collapsing, and this time, I wouldn't be there to catch them. For the first time in years, I felt truly free. Free from the obligation to fix other people's problems while being treated like an inconvenience. Free from the expectation that I'd always be there to provide financial support without receiving emotional support in return. 3 days later, I got a voicemail from Mom, her voice thick with tears, begging me to reconsider, saying the family was falling apart and it was all her fault. She was right about one thing, it was her fault. But the family had been falling apart long before I canceled that autopay. I just finally stopped pretending it was my responsibility to hold it together. The house sold at foreclosure auction 6 weeks later for $265,000. After paying off the mortgage and associated costs, I cleared about $45,000, money I immediately put toward a down payment on my own place. A house that would have my name on the deed, my name on the mortgage, and my name on the mailbox, with locks that only I could change. My parents never contacted me again after the sale. My sister sent one final text saying she hoped I was happy with what I'd done to the family. I was actually. For the first time in years, I was genuinely happy with the decision I'd made regarding my family. Sometimes the best revenge isn't elaborate or dramatic. Sometimes it's just stepping back and letting people face the natural consequences of their own choices. They'd wanted me gone, wanted to erase me from their lives while keeping my money. They got exactly what they asked for, just not the way they'd expected.